Hello, welcome to Stockholm, capital of Sweden, a place you perhaps associate best with its cultural exports. I'm thinking Scandinois, Swedish meatballs, the pop group ABBA, or perhaps that Swedish design aesthetic. Lots of clean lines and lots of wood. Well, there are plenty of trees here in Sweden. More than half of the country is covered in forest. However, in these days of climate concern and urban living, do forests have a future here in Sweden or elsewhere? If you'll come down to the woods today with us, we will be asking whether forests really do equal green in the environmental sense. We're also going to be asking whether European forest funding really is working to help preserve these sometimes ancient landscapes, not just here in Sweden, but also in Poland and in France. Well, to find out more about Sweden and its forests, we've come to this one not far from Stockholm. We're here to meet Emma Berglund, an expert in forests from the Federation of Swedish Family Forest Owners. Hello there, nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Hi. Now, from the outside, it's probably a cliche, but I think a lot of people have this idea that Swedish people are constantly in the forest. It plays a really big part in your lives. How true is that cliche?
Well, I think it's kind of true. I mean, I usually say that we Swedes live in one big forest. 70% of Sweden is forested, so it's quite present in our life, even though, of course, we also have big urbanization and people living more in the cities and getting kind of disconnected from the nature. But I think compared to many other countries, it's true.
All right, well, let's walk through this lovely forest, and I'd like to know a bit more about climate change. It's such a big issue for everybody around the world currently, especially here in Europe. Now, we're told that forests actively help to combat climate change just by being there. How is that so?
We're used to talk about the 3S in terms of how the forest contributes to climate change mitigation. So it sequesters carbon when it's growing. It takes up carbon from the atmosphere. And then it stores carbon in the trees and in the products. So when the trees are mature, you can harvest them and use the wood to build a house, for example. So you can store the carbon for hundreds of years. The crucial one is the substitution. So you can actually then use this renewable raw material to make innovative and climate-friendly products and energy. Because I think that's like, if we're serious about fighting climate change, we need to find something to replace the fossil fuels, the oils and the plastics.
Now, isn't there a bit of a clash, though, with the industrial side of forestry, all the machines that are used to cut down the trees, the fact that young trees are being planted rather than there being a lot of older trees which have a different environmental value, that sort of thing?
100 years ago, our forests were quite depleted in a poor state, and now we have turned that around and we have twice as much forest today than we had 100 years ago. And we have managed to increase the forest, increase the forest industry, and also take more environmental consideration in the forest management.
Let's talk money. There's the European Common Agricultural Policy, which makes some funding available for forestry. How important is that here in Sweden?
For like the pure forestry perspective, Swedish forest industry is not dependent on EU funding, so it's not important. But if you look at wider like Swedish agriculture and rural development, it's very important. So providing funds, for example, for creating a viable countryside where rural entrepreneurs can conduct their business, which also, of course, the forestry entrepreneurs do and the forest owners. So, for example, funding for broadband can be one of these important things.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us, Emma Berglund.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. And while we're talking about environmental concerns, how to balance them with the forest industry and, of course, the tens of thousands of jobs that it provides, that is a pressing question here in Sweden as elsewhere. Our reporter Luke Brown has been digging deeper into one way that Swedish foresters are trying to evolve what they do to try and make their industry future-proof.
It may look destructive, but this machine is making this Swedish forest healthier and more productive. The best specimens will be harvested at 80 years old. For now, the smaller ones are being chopped down to make space for the bigger trees. Maximising the profitability at this stage could be an important new revenue stream for the sector.
When the machine comes here, he approximately harvests about 1/3 of the trees. When you look at these trees, the smaller trees, mainly pulpwood trees, if we could find out more products to do with them, it's very important for us.
The forest industry represents 20% of jobs in rural areas. Known as its green gold, Sweden's forests, used for timber and paper, have been a key part of the country's economy for over a century. Up till now, the waste and residue like this sawdust has been used for district heating. Now hopes are high to turn it into a new, more valuable commodity, biofuel for vehicles.
This kind of feedstock is very, very suitable. It is a waste. Prices are suitable, and it's a very, very good feedstock to process and to convert it into bioethanol or biochemicals.
The EU announced this year a €13.9 million grant to boost research into producing biofuels from wood. The target: establish a viable chain of production from forest to fuel tank. Here at the CCAB demonstration plant, they're working on the next generation of ethanol production from wood.
Time-wise, I would say in 3 or 4 years we can actually have something up and running. So let's say for 4 years from now there can be a new biofuel industry.
Forestry represents 3% of Sweden's GDP. Using forest biofuels has another advantage. Unlike sources such as maize or palm oil, it doesn't impact on food production. Instead, it reuses waste matter from the existing wood industry.
In the future, you can increase the amount of biofuels that you produce in a much more resource-efficient way. So I don't really see that it will eat out of the pulp and paper production. It can still be an even better symbiosis.
Sweden's government has vowed to be fossil fuel-free by 2045, devoting €140 million a year to energy research. Biofuels for transport will be a key component in reaching that target.
The transport sector is our main challenge to reach the long-term climate goals. It is important that we increase the amount of biofuels in the transport sector, but we also need to change our way of traveling.
Transforming the wood residues into ethanol is only one step in the process. The EU's Horizon 2020 project is working with 11 European companies to produce biofuel for vehicles and aviation. France's Global Bioenergies uses genetically modified bacteria to turn the sugar into hydrocarbons for fuel.
We estimate that with the amount of wood that's available, we could use this technology to build dozens of factories, maybe even 100 factories. Each factory could produce between 50 and 100,000 tons of substitute to fossil fuel hydrocarbons.
The future is closer than you might think. This high-performance car is powered by gasoline that's 34% from renewable sources. The hope is that could be increased to 100% and that Europe's forests could fuel cars like this within 3 years.
We find us back in the forest now. We're here to meet a former Minister for Agriculture and for Rural Affairs, Eskil Erlandsson. Very nice to meet you.
Nice meeting you.
Hi there. Now, just for our viewers, it doesn't look like it, but we really are very central in Stockholm right now, aren't we?
6-7 minutes from the center of Stockholm, from the Royal Castle, for instance, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, let's take a walk in this wood. We've just seen a report about how forestry in Sweden isn't necessarily such a green industry always. From the outside, Sweden very much seen as a country that's interested in the environment. We remember things like the acid rain debate in the 80s and 90s that was very much focused on Sweden. Right now, though, with the elections coming up in the autumn, political discourse seems to be completely dominated by immigration, by nationalism. Is the environment no longer a political priority?
It is. When you go outside in the countryside, the environmental questions are big in the debate.
So what sort of issues are we talking about?
I'll say the climate change, the lack of rain right now, the fires and so on. That's big questions around people that are affected.
Well, there's also the issue of land rights over the forests. Half of Sweden's forests are classed as land where reindeer can be herded, principally by the Sami people. Now, the forestry industry does admit that there are clashes with the Sami over this. Are the Sami right to say that their rights are being trampled on by this march of industry and modernity?
No, as I see it, no. They have their rights, but the landowners also have their right, for instance, to cut the trees and use the trees.
Well, currently there's a sort of a consultation process that happens when there are clashes between industry and Sami. Groups such as Amnesty International, however, backing up the Sami and saying that they are being marginalised. Is it perhaps time to give the Sami better rights enshrined in Swedish law, or a clearer process?
It's hard to have laws around everything. The Swedish legislations means that they have to consult each other when they do things. I think that's the best way of dealing with the problem.
Well, on a related issue, a Sami association has recently joined legal action being launched by several groups across Europe against the EU institutions. They claim that Brussels isn't doing enough to stop climate change, which they say threatens their way of life, their ability to herd. What do you make of that case? Is it a battle they can win?
It's affect the way that the Sami people can deal with their reindeers, for instance. The snow melts and then it freezes again and makes it hard for the reindeers to reach the grass under the snow and the ice. If the world doesn't come together, then it will be a crisis for the Sami people, but also for all of us.
Now, as we know, part of the European agriculture funding is specifically earmarked for forestry. Do you think it's right that in the next budget, which is currently being negotiated, that these sorts of considerations should be taken into account more actively?
The next budget has to face rural development, but not especially the forests. The forest industry in Sweden is going well and can deal with their own possibilities and problems.
Do you see the EU as interfering in the forests?
Yeah, they does. When they tell us how much we can cut in the Swedish forest, it affects us.
What kind of involvement do you want the EU to have in Sweden's forests?
They have to face the climate change, things that we can't do something around ourselves. The Swedish forest has been legislated for more than 100 years, and it has served Sweden and Europe very, very well.
Well, thanks very much for your thoughts, Eskil Erlandsson.
Thank you. Nice meeting you.
You too, thank you. Well, from these well-ordered Swedish woods to Poland and something rather different now. Białowieża is one of Europe's last remaining primordial forests. The European Court of Justice recently ruled that logging should be stopped there. The Polish government agreed, but somewhat reluctantly, as our correspondent Gulliver Cragg reports.
The primeval forest floor. The forest's composition is ever shifting, shaped by nature, not people. Yet in Poland's Białowieża forest, tens of thousands of protected trees have been cut down since 2016.
Logging took place in areas where the spruce trees were up to 165 years old after the European Court of Justice ordered to halt it on the 27th of July last year.
It wasn't until this year that the Polish government finally complied with the court's injunction. Environmentalists patrol the area to check the logging really has stopped.
The forester's car has stopped up there, so I'm recording that and noting the GPS coordinates.
Foresters are respecting the EU court's ruling because they have to, but they openly disagree with it. They say logging is needed to fight a bark beetle outbreak that has killed thousands of spruces.
Cut and remove. That's the only solution.
The court ruling is one thing, but we still cooperate with the EU on various habitat protection projects.
Like this watchtower, also a response to the bark beetle outbreak.
We need this fire lookout tower because the beetle outbreak has left a huge amount of dead, dry trees around, so there's a big fire risk. Previously, it was mainly a wet forest.
The EU is also contributing to a programme to clear ponds and improve conditions for newts and frogs. Such interventions seem perfectly natural to Polish foresters, who say that in reality only small patches of Białowieża are truly untouched.
This is probably the most valuable and best preserved fragment of Europe's ancient forests, and well worth taking of, but it's not correct to call it primeval.
Environmentalists disagree. They insist nature should be allowed to take its course, and are setting up a permanent information point here to argue their case.
People should not decide the fate of every natural environment on Earth. They have no right to do so.
Amid such vehement disagreement, the EU is also backing a local government campaign to foster dialogue. But the State Forests Company has withdrawn its participation.
Well, it's time now for us to leave Sweden, heading much further south for our next destination. We're taking you to the French Mediterranean island of Corsica, a place where climate change, forest fires and even funding tussles are said to be threatening the local forest landscapes. Do stay with us for part 2.
We are journalists, and normally you have to listen to us, but you have things to tell us too. Maybe you've experienced a dramatic event, or you've got something important to say. You want to make a difference. That is why we created The Observers. Now, the first step is very easy. You get in touch with our team. Send us your images, tell us what you've seen. And then it's our job to get your voice out there, on our site, on social networks, on your mobiles and tablets, and on TV, of course. You can appear in our weekly show via webcam. Or perhaps we'll come see you in person, where you live, in your country, your town, and we'll work together on a report for our investigative show, The Observers Direct. So you get the idea. This show is your show, your way to get your voice out to the world.